Okay.
It's all right. I can do that.
I can introduce myself.
There we go. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second to last evening lecture series of this academic year. So, you all know me. My name is Joshua Paxton, Faculty Senate President. To my left here is soon-to-be Dr. Timothy Hange, who will be speaking for us tonight. And so Tim and his wife Karen were missionaries in Moscow for 8 years, and they've been here at Calvary for 4 years now.
Oh my goodness. Four, almost five.
Something?
Yeah.
Almost 5. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. It's kind of blurry for me
Yeah,
too.
it is.
COVID does that to people. So, well, welcome everyone. I have known them for a lot longer than that,
Yes.
and so I'm very happy to hear from him tonight. I do want to give a big thank you to Calvary's Alumni Association for providing our snacks tonight. Be sure to check those out. Help yourself. And without much further ado, I will turn it over to soon-to-be Dr. Hange.
All right. Thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it. And I hope that you are able to glean something from this. Really, the utility of this talk is twofold. One, if you've thought about the idea of what would it be like to learn another language, I think this will really help you. I think also it can help you if you are working with people who are trying to learn another language. If you ever find yourself in that position, I think that you will find this talk to be hopefully not just theoretical but practical. We have here a little formula that I wrote: right theory plus right practice plus right motivation equals right results in language. Now, I grew up in a multilingual family, in a bilingual family, I should say. My mother spoke Greek to me until I was school age, and so I went back and forth between Greek and English. Around school age, I decided I didn't want to speak my home language anymore. I wanted to speak English. That happens very common with school age children. And so I kind of lost a lot of the Greek, but I've also relearned a lot of it. My big language learning experience and challenge came out of the blue, a complete surprise to me when God got my wife and I involved in Russia. It began with an adoption in 2002. I started learning a little bit of Russian, just some words and phrases I could say to the children. I had a Russian teacher help me just write down some things I could say, like, don't be afraid, like, we're getting on an airplane now, like, we'll be out of the airplane soon. I was trying to think of what, those poor children, they were in the airplane for 8-hour flight, and they don't know. They think this is like some permanent situation. They're just beside themselves. It was really tough. Anyway, but it started with that, and then God really just kindled an interest in us for that people group. And over the next few years, from 2003 to about 2009, I was trying to learn Russian. Now, in 2007, I wasn't really getting anywhere. I was trying a lot of the same things that I bet you have tried when you try to learn a language, and it did nothing for me. I found myself in 2007, having made the decision to go to live in Russia and serve in Russia, realizing that I know a few things, but boy, not nearly as much as I would have hoped to have known by now. I can't even just hold a basic conversation. I mean, I couldn't even start a basic conversation despite having done so much work. That was around the time I began my master's degree in education with a focus in teaching English as a second language. And I took one class that blew me away, and it was second language acquisition. It just took me down the rabbit hole. I'll tell you what, and it has since then. It is my most loved topic in academia. It's also a topic we know the least about. One of the topics we know the least about in academia. Really, most of the work that's been done in second language acquisition, most of the really successful work, has been done in the last 50 years. So it's a relatively new field, kind of the Wild West of academia. My doctorate, my research for my doctoral program involved a study of 10 adults who did not begin learning English until adulthood, who became fluent, and I mean fluent. I found 10 that were actually well above the minimum bar that I had set for fluency. We're talking about people that went on to get master's degrees or bachelor's and master's degrees in English from American and British universities. Absolutely amazing, their command. And I found some very interesting and sometimes even shocking things. I'll just give you one of the findings. 4 of the 10 had no formal training. They took no English classes. Not a single one did any kind of self-paced Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, listen to cassettes kind of thing. Come on in, just find a seat. You might, oh good. I thought you were gonna have to sit next to Josh. Okay, so really some interesting findings. So what I'm sharing to you tonight is not just theoretical. Oh, by the way, to finish my story out, I began applying those very things I was learning about in second language acquisition to myself. And yes, it did coincide with the time that I moved to Russia. Within a year of setting foot in Russia, I was actually quite comfortably conversationally fluent. Within 2 years, I was business fluent. In the final year before we left, I managed a building project with Russian building contractors, dealing directly with Russian government officials, fully in Russian. I was in line one time at an office, and I was speaking with somebody, and I said, they said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Can you take a guess?" And they said, "Well, pronunciation good, but a little different. Occasional grammar error. I'm going to say Croatia." I was shocked. I mean, it was one of the greatest compliments of my life. And actually, that's not the first time that happened to me. But I was actually able to at least pass for Slavic. Right? By the way, with Russians, I typically told them I'm Greek. That's not a lie. Didn't want to say American if you could avoid it.
Yeah.
So anyway, how to learn a language. Let's dive in. Okay, for today, what I mean by learn a language is spoken fluency. Okay, we're going to set aside writing, and I might allude to that later why. But writing is actually not. Yeah, writing is. Let's just stick with spoken fluency. So being able to listen, to hear messages and speak in the language, to hold spontaneous, sophisticated, comprehensible conversations with people. This would be the dream thing of, you go to China and you get off the plane, you're able to ask for directions to a hotel, you meet up with some people from a church, you're able to hold conversations, talk about your family, talk about theology. That would be everybody's dream, right? To be able to be that fluent in a language. This is what we're talking about. And by the way, it's achievable as adults. I'm going to start here. There is a lot of junk research, unfortunately. I should not say junk. Outdated research by Lenneberg in the and even to be fair to Lenneberg, people took his research and ran with it when he said, "Look, I'm just positing an idea here. This isn't provable," saying that languages were not learnable, fully learnable, if you're post-puberty. Okay, adults operate on this with this idea that, well, I'm a grown-up now. I can't learn a language. Actually, you can. So we're going to get there. But what do we really mean by learn a language? Okay, that's the question. Because the problem I had was I didn't really know what this meant. And I was aiming at a target I didn't understand. All right. Step 1 to learning a language, get clear on what the language is and get clear on how the brain acquires language. Let's look at some history. I'll say that word really quickly and we'll move on so you don't phase out. Okay, some history. Okay, the curious case of Francois Gouin. Francois Gouin was an exceptional man. He had a near photographic memory. He was, in 1892, he was a linguist, a French linguist. In 1892, he conducted what was unwittingly one of the greatest case studies or even self-experiments in language. He committed himself to learning German. I'm going to learn German. He decides, I'm going to fly over to Germany, rent an apartment, and live there for a year. So he does. Before he flies over, he takes a book on verbs, and he memorizes 248 verbs, not just the verbs and their meanings, but because German is an inflected language, he memorized all their language forms so that he would be able to use it in speech. He began memorizing words from a dictionary, which he eventually memorized over 30,000 words from the dictionary. Not kidding. He also memorized a grammar book in its entirety. He landed in Germany, went out on the street, tried to have a conversation, and could not. This was the greatest experiment that we are still not listening to in language teaching. That academic knowledge of a language does not produce spoken fluency. It doesn't. But Mr. Hange, how can that possibly be? I mean, are you saying what we're doing here at Calvary is bad? Because don't we teach kind of like this whole grammar and we call it the grammar translation method, the classic method? Yeah, you do, and you do it for Koine Greek, and you do it for ancient Hebrew. And guess what? You're never going to be fluent in those languages. But guess what? You kind of don't need to be because they're sort of outdated, right? Although admittedly, a lot of those Greek words we still use today. I'm surprised at how much of the old Greek I can look at and understand, even though I know the modern Greek. Point being, though, the academic language that we learn here is only from the standpoint of being able to read texts, interpret them. But if ancient Greeks were still around, I just set myself up for that one. You wouldn't be able to speak to them with this approach, with this method. So I'm not saying what we do here is bad. It's fine because the goal is not spoken fluency. But if you take the same approach and you try to apply it, see, we have this misnomer. We think that language is like other academic areas like math. Okay, in math, you learn this formula and then you're presented with a problem and then you recognize, this problem is I have to solve for these two variables. This is the quadratic equation, and so you apply the quadratic equation, you solve it, and if you've gotten the right answer out of the end, well, then you're done. Language is infinitely more complex. You may think the quadratic equation is this incredibly obtuse, complex thing. It's not nearly as complex as what happens every time you have a conversation with your friends. You ideate. At the same time that you ideate, your mind is attaching words to those ideas, and then they just come out of your mouth almost automatically as your brain reaches into experiential centers and pulls out the structures that you should use to communicate. I mean, I'm doing it right now. I'm not scripted. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants. Who knows what will come out of my mouth next, right? But anyway, the point is that it's a very complex thing that's happening in your brain, and you don't have time at this moment. I do not have the time to think about grammar as I'm trying to speak. This is why the academic knowledge won't help you with spoken fluency. Mostly. And we'll get to that in a bit. But in general, this is what it's not explainable through formula. It is more like painting or music or composition. We're going to talk about this in a moment. That language learning is a skill thing. It's not like a knowledge thing. In academics, and I say it's a problem in America, but it's not just here. We tend to divorce doing from knowing, right? And it's a real issue. I could do a whole talk about that. But painting, you can learn all sorts of things about. I'm not a painter. Winging it here about mixing colors and the color wheel and certain types of media and pigments and how they mix and what kinds of strokes you should use and where you could watch Bob Ross day in day out, right? But you haven't learned how to paint. You're only going to learn that by putting a brush in your hand and putting some paint on the canvas, right? Language is that kind of thing. It takes this tactile, this knowledge that's built and skill that's built through actual use, and we're going to be showing you why that is in a bit more. These are some of my favorite people in the universe. Okay, Lev Vygotsky. These are like my time machine people. Okay, I know Bible times and all that, but if it couldn't be Bible times, it was limited to the last 200 years. This is where I'd be going. I'd be going to have lunch with Lev Vygotsky. And Lev Vygotsky is one of the first people to say, yeah, look, here, he was born around the time that Wayne was doing his experiments, and when he grew up, he began to think, language is a really interesting thing. It's not like a learned behavior like my buddy B.F. Skinner, who was born around the same time, is trying to say. he says, no, it's way more complex than learned behavior. He says, actually, your language and your cognition develop side by side. That's an interesting thing. That there's this deep connection between the first time you saw a dog and your mom or dad said doggy, and you were like, oh, that's a doggy. Your brain conceptualized that and put a word with it. That's a very powerful thing, right? So language is learned, he says, in a ZPD, in the zone of proximal development. This is very simple. He had this whole I+1, that you learn best in an environment where things are just above your level, right? It's still attainable.
It's called the flow theory.
Flow theory.
Yes.
Just above your level. Too easy, you're not going to learn anything. Too difficult, you're not going to learn anything. This led to some, and these weren't purely his observations, but led to some other thinking. And this gets a little controversial, and I may even get some pushback from people in this room, but that's okay, let's go for it. There is no pure form of a language. You need to understand this, there was no great British prophet who came down from the mountain with the grammar book and handed it to the people and said, this is your language, this is what you will be using, and it must follow these rules. When you think about things like verb conjugations, like verb tenses, do you realize they just arise in communities as people use language? It just happens. Nobody, so I'm what we call language descriptivist. We look at grammar and we say, look, we're describing what's happening in the community. There is room for prescribing, but in general, in terms of how it develops, we have to say it just developed among the group of people subconsciously as they used language. Okay, these are the things that guys like Vygotsky are beginning to notice. Okay, let me give you a little bit of, let's go on to Noam Chomsky. Whatever you may think of Noam, he's got some pretty whack political views, but whatever you may think of Noam Chomsky, and this guy's still around, man, he's 93, I think, now. His work in, I believe it was Syntactic Structures, where he first introduced the idea of the language acquisition device and universal grammar. He's an atheist, but here he gives, I think, one of the strongest proofs of the existence of God. He says, after studying the human brain and after studying how we interact with language, the conclusion I reach is that the brain has a pre-wired center for language. And that not only that, but the brain already comes when you're born with a set of abstractions like verb, noun. So don't think of universal grammar as like some secret angelic language that we all know. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that the universal grammar is these abstractions we have, do you guys ever wonder why so many languages in the world have nouns, verbs, prepositions, or little add-ons that function as prepositions? Yes, I know, inflected languages. I got to be on my toes here with you linguists in the room. But they have so many of the same elements. Why? Because our brains, they're hardwired into our brains. This abstraction is hardwired into our brains. And he says it's fascinating that none of the other animals have it. Really? It's fascinating. It's almost like, I don't know, we're made in the image of the one divine God or something. But anyway, that's, I marvel sometimes that people can't see the divine in moments like this. But here are the big implications. Everybody jumped on this, and I think they're right. And we've been on this since Chomsky brought out syntactic structures, because it explains so much. Listen, there are very rare cases where and they're very difficult, but under normal circumstances, you would never have somebody who would walk out to a car, open the hood, and go, oh yeah, I can fix this. I've never messed with a car before, but I know exactly what's happening here, because it's naturally hardwired into my brain. No, being a car mechanic is something you have to learn. There are a couple of areas that are sort of maybe, music is one. There does seem to be, I think there may be some hardwiring for music. But think about, like woodworking or all these other skills we learn in life, mathematics, etc. Right? It's not hardwired into our brain. You can't say that somebody has natural ability in that. And I know that's sort of this goes into a whole other argument of whether things like natural talents really exist, and that is an argument we're having in human cognitive studies right now. But what I'm trying to say is, you need to think of it this way: you were born with a natural talent and ability to learn a language. Even in cases, now I realize not everybody has this. Like, there are children who are born with severe, brain issues, right? But have you noticed, even like Down syndrome kids, like especially high functioning, they'll accumulate a vocabulary of a couple thousand words, and they automatically acquire some grammar and use. Like, isn't that fascinating? That even a child with that kind of challenge has some language talent and can speak more English than maybe billions of people around the world can. It's because it's hardwired. That language ability is hardwired. Okay, so here are the. It does cut it off a little bit there. Joshua. Oh well. Okay, humans have natural language, aching, and listening ability. Speaking. Humans have natural speaking and listening ability. Okay, we activate our language acquisition through social interaction and comprehensible input. I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. Learning of language forms is largely subconscious. Here's how I want to prove that to you. Okay, I'm going to ask somebody in the room, Zakoya. I want you to answer in a full sentence, okay? Just because I know you're one of my few students I have who's capable of. No, I'm joking. I am joking about that. Any other students who are watching? So, Zakoya, answer in a full sentence. How many countries have you visited? Begin with I.
I have visited 3 countries.
You have?
Yes, I have.
Okay, why did you say I have visited? You could have just said I was in 3 countries, couldn't you? Does that sound right to you? If I say, how many countries have you visited? You say, I was in 3 countries. Does that sound right? You know why? Do you know what verb tense you're using when you say have visited?
Don't remember.
Anybody?
You're not using a tense, you're using an aspect.
There you go, using an aspect. Using an aspect called the present perfect. Okay? What's the job of the present perfect? Well, the job of the present perfect is to connect things that are done in the past with the present. Let's say that this is now, right? And so let's say I have been running all day. I've just used the present progressive, right? To talk about something that happened in the past and is happening up until now. Okay? When we talk about life experiences, it is best to use the present perfect because it is something that happens from the past until now. Do you guys know that rule? Did you guys know that rule before I just said it?
Yes.
Actually, all of you should shake your head yes. You knew the rule. You just didn't know that you knew the rule. How did you figure out that rule? What Michael Lewis, and he's done some fascinating research on chunk theory and chunk learning, what he's suggesting, and I think that this is true, is that you hear people use have in certain usage scenarios. Have been, I've been doing this, I've been doing this, and your brain puts it together subconsciously. Your brain understands the rule subconsciously through exposure to these language chunks. It will put it together. It'll develop the rule subconsciously, and you know how to use it, even though you don't really know how to use it. But you really know how to use it. So, okay. And a lot of people think they're weird. It's like, oh, I must have never paid attention in school when I was a kid, because I don't know any of the grammar. I just know how to speak. No, that's actually the very natural state that most human beings have, right? Unless you're a grammar geek, like some of us were. Like, I was a kid who liked diagramming sentences. But most normal people don't. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly normal. All right, this is the input hypothesis by Stephen Krashen. I'm kind of giving you a progression of where we're going, and then what I'm going to do, so look forward to this hopefully, is that I will hand out a step-by-step guide to how to learn a second language, a possible step-by-step guide that you can take, adapt, and use for your own. Okay, Stephen Krashen came around in the 80s. He was doing a lot of work on what he called this input hypothesis, the monitor model. He built on Vygotsky, he built on Chomsky's work, and he had already a PhD in grammatical studies. This was a guy who was committed to academic study of language, and he was very, very frustrated because it wasn't working. He was also a practitioner teaching English as a second language, and it wasn't working with the people and so he began to completely change his thinking, and he came up with this hypothesis that we learn the language when we hear signals that we understand that are just above what we know, that are in our zone of proximal development, when we are in a low anxiety environment. That's how humans learn language, and that every human learns language that way. The tough thing about him, and he's in his 70s now, you can still find him out on YouTube talking, he still holds to this, and I don't agree with him on this. And a lot of us in this profession don't. He says this is the only way to learn language. That you should not try to speak from the beginning, that only causes anxiety, that you need, he calls it a silent period, and that speaking naturally will emerge after that silent period. There's some truth to the fact that we need receptive before productive, but in any case, this was his theory. I will tell you this, you'll hear comprehensible input used all over the place. Do you remember in our PSYOP book, like comprehensible input was one of the key components of that, right? Of teaching children. The whole idea is to make the input comprehensible to them. So he was very, very right on this, but he was wrong, in my opinion, about comprehensible input being both a necessary and sufficient factor to acquire language. I believe it is necessary, but I do not believe it is sufficient. Now, this is another one of my favorite people, Michael Long. Still around. I watch he's a boring delivery, but his content is so exciting. I really enjoy listening to him. But he purports the interaction hypothesis, and he says, hey, Krashen, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying comprehensible input isn't part of it, but here's the deal. Humans acquire language, as Vygotsky said, through social interaction, so that's where it needs to begin. If you want to learn a second language, you're going to have to begin by sitting down, having a conversation with somebody, as primitive as it may be, and negotiating for meaning. This is the big one. What happens when we negotiate for meaning? That person says, I don't understand. Do you mean this? And that person will echo the right words, and you'll say, yeah, that's the word, and then you'll hear the grammar form that he uses. Maybe you'll get it, and you'll say it, especially if that person, as you start getting more advanced, corrects your grammar as part of the negotiation for meaning. Learning will happen. This is what he's saying. And so he's saying grammar should not be driving. Grammar concerns should not be driving the curriculum. The learner needs to drive the curriculum. Find out what the learner wants and needs to talk about, and build your curriculum around that, and let what he calls incidental learning happen. See, here's another thing about language. Like, I don't know if you've ever taught a class and then you say a word and you're surprised that there's maybe a student or two who doesn't know that word, but they're a pretty intelligent student. How did that happen? It's just that they happen not to have counted that word enough, right? This is what happens. Incidental learning happens because the rate at which the words that we acquire are not like in some order. They happen based on what we're exposed to, okay? So it was, it was a couple years in Russia. I was pretty confident in my Russian. I decided, I can sit here and talk with my linguist friends all day long in Russian about language. Something breaks under my sink, I take that off, I go to the hardware store and I say, I need to buy the, and I use the word shtuka, which means thingy. This thing goes into this other thingy that kind of looks like this, and it goes into another thingy, and the guy's just looking at me like, holy cow, man. Like, how am I supposed to make anything of that? I'm like, I'll go back and take a photo of it. He goes like, yeah, you do that. So, but like, I didn't know those words because I just had not encountered those words, right? So we learn words incidental. If I were a plumber in Russia, incidentally, I would have known those words. Hey, is this immersion? This is where Kristen and I may argue. Okay, I want to address right now the immersion myth, what I would call the immersion myth. A lot of people, even missionaries I met, had this idea. I'll just come to the country And in 6 months, I'll just know the language because I'll just pick it up from everything that's happening around me. No, you won't. You won't if meaningful interaction and comprehensible input were not present. The example I like to use is if I were to sit down and watch a Japanese news broadcast. I might catch hello, I might catch goodbye. I don't know, there might be an occasional word there, but 99.99% of it would go over my head. So what should I do? I'll just watch it again. I'll watch news broadcasts again for 8 hours that day. Is that going to help? No. A week later? No. A month later? No. A year later? No. Nope, it's too far over my head. I'm not going to learn it. Immersion alone does not do the trick. Now, immersion combined with meaningful interactions and comprehensible input will do the trick. Now, let's learn some Russian. So here's my Russian lesson that I'm going to give you. Здравствуйте, студенты. Сегодня мы будем учить части тела, но особенно мы будем сосредоточиваться над головой. Вот дело в том, что у каждого человека здесь есть голова. У каждого голова есть два глаза, две уши, нос и рот. Спасибо за ваше внимание. Thank you for your attention. So, tell me about how much you learned.
Student.
Студенты? Right. Okay. So, I might use the board for this one a little bit, but let's I don't know, I might not even have to. Здравствуйте, студенты. Здравствуйте. Давайте. Здравствуйте. Хорошо. Сегодня наш урок касается тела. У меня есть голова. У меня есть голова.
У меня есть голова.
У меня есть голова. У тебя есть голова?
Нет.
Да, у меня есть
У меня есть
голова.
голова.
Голова. Вот, в голове есть глаз, один глаз, и два глаза. Два глаза. У меня есть два глаза. Давайте. У меня есть два глаза. Да. Может быть, у тебя есть три глаза? Нет. У доктора Битмер есть три глаза. У нормального человека только два глаза. Вот. У нас тоже нос, один нос. И у нас тоже рот. Давайте вот рот. Не рот на английском. Рот. Okay. What did you guys learn?
That was better.
Eyes, one nose, and a mouth.
Right?
Dr. Fittner has an eye in the
You
back of
learned.
his head.
Now, you may not remember all those things like immediately, and you might think, wow, I have a really bad memory. I don't remember all those things immediately. No, actually, it takes about 10 to 15 interactions with a word for it to stick, right?
16.
16? 16. Although a marker of language aptitude is memory. People who have a good memory
The
actually.
average person takes 16.
Yeah. So, what if I gave you a diet of that? If you're really motivated to learn Russian, which hardly anybody is right now, but if you're really motivated to learn Russian, what if I gave you a diet of, say, an hour of that every day? You'd have some simple conversations that would start emerging very quickly. Within a year, I think you'd be actually able to hold some normal conversations. We kept progressing at where that would take you. Now, it would be good to give you some handouts. It would be good to give, and of course, you're going to need to learn the letters and some of the sounds. I'm not saying that no level of academic study is necessary, but I am saying this, and Michael Long says this too. He says he doesn't advocate for solely that kind of teaching, but he's saying if that's all, if you had to choose between that and academic study, choose that, because that'll get you there. Academic study won't, right? Only by itself. Okay. Communicative competence. Meryl Swain and Cannell, I just like crediting her because she was really the primary instigator of this and has done a lot of great language research since then. she identified, look, out of all of this that we're seeing, we need to redefine what it means to know a language, because we still have this notion that language is all about just words and grammar. She says, no. Words and grammar are 1/4 of the equation. The second part is discourse competence. How well are you able to sort of put together your thoughts into a reasonable flow, right? Strategic competence. How well are you able to communicate something with what's, see, that's great. I'm faltering and I need strategic competence at this point. How well are you able to communicate something with what language you have, right? Are you willing to take chances and take risks and rearrange words? I went to a Russian store one time and I needed to ask for powdered sugar. I didn't know what powdered sugar was, so I said like molotny, like ground sugar. She's like, I said, no, выглядит как мука, но это сахар. In other words, it looks like flour, but it's sugar. Aha, she says, and she gives me the word for it. She points me to the aisle. And it was a completely different kind of word, right? That's strategic competence, right? How well you're able, that's a very primitive example of strategic competence. And social linguistic competence. Of course, this is not just avoiding taboo things, although this matters, but things like body language, things like how much you should say when somebody asks you, how are you? A Russian person fresh to the country will respond with a very, very long answer because you asked them. Okay, they may not understand that, no, they really don't want to know how you are. They just want you to say, fine, thank you. So this is a all of these things work together to form communicative competence. If we're only teaching to one, then we're not teaching enough. We're not teaching people really to communicate. All of these factors need to be all these components need to be present. This led ultimately to the communicative approach, which is being brutally simplified here. But basically, an approach to language teaching that focuses on interaction, it focuses on comprehensible input that is authentic and meaningful, and it focuses on meaning over form. And sometimes it works well, and sometimes it doesn't. Because some teachers will walk into a classroom and think, well, all this means is just that we just talk about whatever and have no structure to the class whatsoever, and you find that learners sort of get burnt out and they're not really going anywhere. This needs to be thoughtfully done. How do you thoughtfully do it? We're still figuring this out. Because we're still, I think, very early in the game. And we still find a lot of curriculum, even that says it's communicative, looking more like academic stuff. And it's like, yeah, I thought this is a communicative curriculum. Because we're still retraining our brains. The ripple effect of how we've been taught in academia just continues to work its way out into language, and we've got to retrain our brains. So, does studying grammar have a place? Yes, it does. I think that clock back there is a little behind, so I need to, okay. I'm going to rush through this part really quick. It does, but not in the way that you think. Grammar rules will not help you at the moment to keep from making a mistake. But what they will do is help you analyze your mistakes and think about them metacognitively so that you're a little less likely to make them the next time. And the more of a diet you get of that, the better off you'll be. That's also a contribution of Merrill Swain and Schmidt's noticing hypothesis too. So yes, it does help. I'm not saying to completely exclude it, but don't make it 100% a part of. So, second language, I'm going to skip a couple things. Second language, though. See, a lot of what I've said, what?
You're fine.
A lot of what I've said applies to first language learning. I've kind of mixed, like Krashen and Long were talking more about second language learning. But when you learn a second language, you have a problem and an opportunity. You have interference. The interference is, when I go to use the word go in Russian, I have to figure out, am I talking about going by foot or going by car? Because if I'm going by car, I need to use a different set of verbs. I also need to know whether it's a unidirectional going or whether it is a there and back going, because that requires a different verb. So the fact that in English it's just one verb for go interferes with my ability to understand the Russian construct, right? So that's a problem, is the way you've learned things interferes with how it's coded in the other language. But there's also transfer. There's a lot that I know in English that transfers over to Russian. A lot of the word order, even though word order is more fluid in Russian, is the same. A lot of the prepositions, even though there are fewer prepositions in Russian, are used very similarly. So, like, there are things that will transfer. So this is the puzzle of learning a second language, and it's going to take a lot of work, which brings me to this point. You're going to need motivation. I am now going to bring you to my favorite researcher. He moved the field of second language learning motivation forward so much. Godly man, believer. You can read papers by him on the Great Commission in academia. I mean, and most people didn't even know it. His work was so excellent in the language motivation area. He threw things. I gush about Zoltan Dornier. And is that not the coolest name? I want that name, Zoltan Dornier. Like, man. Anyway, Hungarian academic. We've been mucking about with intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. He's saying, no, it's way more complicated than this. Okay, and he built on some other theorists who were already stretching things. That he simplified it to this. The L2, this is grossly oversimplified, but he says there's an ideal L2 self. L2 is your second language that you need to have pictured in your mind. For me, I didn't want to be Russian. Here's why. They would never accept me as Russian because I'm not Slavic and I was not born on Russian soil. It's not like in America where, supposedly you can tell somebody, hey, just come, we're a country of immigrants, come here, be American. You can't do that in Russia, right? So I set my goal appropriately. I want to be an engaged foreigner who's so knowledgeable and respectful of their language that I have a platform with these people. That was my goal. I hungered for that goal. That goal had two components to it. Instrumental, there are things I wanted to be able to do. I wanted to be able to teach in the language. There are all sorts of functional things I wanted to be able to do, but it was also integrative. In other words, it had to do with how I socialized with the people and who I would become in my ideal L2 self. If you do not have this kind of motivation, the likelihood that you will learn a language is very, very low. So, example, I do take some clients on the side. Saturday nights, late at night, I'm working with a kid in China. Early Monday and Friday mornings, I have a student in Japan, super early. And whenever I get students, whenever I get a referral, and I ask them what their motivation is, and they say, oh, I just want to learn some English so when I go traveling, I can speak to people. 3 months. That's tops. That's all I'll get out of them. That motivation is not enough to sustain you. Your brain does return on investment calculations, like it does with everything else. About 2 months into it, you're going to be like, at this rate, it's going to take me a couple of years to learn this. And I'm spending money and time, and I don't know, it's just not really that. That motivation does not motivate me to get up every day and do, an hour worth of reading or watching some movie in English. It's just not enough. It's not going to be enough to sustain you, so you won't. You just won't. You have to find a motivation that is strong enough and is kind of how I describe sustain you. So, what's the plan? Here's your sample step-by-step guide. I'll talk you through this. I'm going to try to do about a 5-minute blast on this, maybe 10. And then I'll leave a few minutes for questions if you could hand those back. If you can hand these back. Okay. So, the whole first part is trying to summarize what we just talked about. Get clear enough on what language is and how it's learned. Like, you don't need to be an expert in second language acquisition, but you need to know some of the basics. And if I were going to give you 3 bullet points, I would say this. You need comprehensible input and you need meaningful interaction. It's more of a doing thing than a knowing thing, and lose the idea that it's about grammar and vocabulary. Print off that communicative competence model. If you've already forgotten what it is, look it up online, print it, put it on your wall. That's what it means to be communicatively competent. Get clear on your motivations, because it's going to be a long haul, right? If you don't, you're going to have to really want this, and you're going to have to enjoy it. If you get these things lined up, every single one of the my 10 research subjects had this kind of intense motivation when they began. Every single one, without exception. That's why I'm looking forward to seeing if I can convince somebody to partner with me on a large-scale study based on the small-scale quantitative study. There are some certain factors that presented with unanimity across the group. This is one of them. clear. I asked these people, what did you do when you got discouraged? That's a big thing that language learners have to manage. They all looked at me. Most of them looked at me deer in the headlights. What do you mean? Like when you got discouraged, was to get discouraged. I wanted this. I was just going to do it. Okay. Like they didn't, so, anyway, that's how strong their motivations were. Have a plan. Okay. This plan is partially based on what I've seen work in other people. There's a lot based on what I did after I learned a few things about second language acquisition. First, you are going to have to begin by learning the alphabet and pronunciation, beginning to read. You're going to have to get the grammar book and get started on that. Now, you're kind of doing that, and here's why I think. It doesn't apply to Japanese and Chinese. You're going to need to learn to speak to begin with, I think. Because holy cow, that symbolic system is not like, it's not a phonetic alphabet. I know there's reduced forms and all of that. But I do think that this is helpful. Read real materials. These are the kinds of things I started with. The actual things I started with, I loaned to friends. They never gave me back turkeys. But these were the kinds of things I started with. These were like my B choices. But, I started with these little children's books, right? And actually, these are like really babyish. But once I got past these to where I can read some of the like children's adventures and stories, I discovered Russia's really rich with cool literature for kids. Like, I was enjoying this. This is really a lot of fun for me. I eventually graduated, to the dismay of my Russian teacher, to like Russian fantasy and sci-fi. She's like, why are you reading that garbage? Because it helps me learn the language. But see, that's and I'm going to talk about this. You got to do something you enjoy in the language every day. I was loving this. I was really enjoying this. Okay, read real materials. Choose books that are just above your level. That's going to be everything at first. I know, your first couple of books, even the little ones, are going to be a slog. I get it. Don't just make vocab lists with definitions. You're doing Gawain memorization. It's not going to help you. If you're going to write down words, write down the whole sentence in which you heard that you heard, or that you saw it in the book. Even better, let the book itself, this is a book that I marked up in Russia, let the book itself, I would just go back into the book and I'd say, I want to review some vocabulary. I'll just pick one of the books I read, look at my little notes on top of these sentences, and I'm reviewing that vocabulary. Okay, that was super helpful for me. Read for fluency. Don't look up every word. So what I did there, I would go back after. So here's what reading for fluency is. Reading for fluency is you pick something that's just above your level. You force yourself not to look up a single word when you read a chapter. You get to the end of the chapter and you'll go through stretches where you don't understand anything, but then you'll understand like a word here, a word there, and you get to the chapter and ask yourself, how much did I understand? Like, what did I get out of this chapter? You'll be surprised after you started learning the language that you got the general flow of things. And you're guessing at the meaning of words. That's super rich, super important for you, right? You can't just look it up in the dictionary or go by the definition you've looked at before. Like the word great can mean many things in the English language. Somebody says, great, now I have to do this. You read it in a book, you think, oh, this person thinks it's good. Or this challenge is too great, it's too heavy, etc. Right? So, read. That's why guessing at the meaning of the words will help you see those multiple definitions. Right? Choose books that will help you learn about the culture. So don't read translated material. But when I got to the level, I was like, I want to read Chronicles of Narnia in Russian. I got bored after a few minutes. I was like, this whole thing is written like a Russian person was trying to translate from English, which is exactly what it is, right? It's like, I want to read Russian stories that are about, Russian things, and you learn about like Russian, history and apartment buildings and the whole culture. You learn all about that, through that. And by the way, you learn a lot of cultural references too. We'll talk about it in a moment. Get a tutor and give your tutor these rules. Teach me only in the target language. Do not use English with me. Don't try to impress me. Don't say this, but don't try to impress me with your English. Right? Teach me only in the target language. Bring conversation topics so that we can spend most of the time in actual conversation, no matter how simple. Correct my main mistakes, leave the rest. Just choose like the main mistakes I'm making. Only correct those, because if they correct everything, you're not going to be able to flow into a natural conversation. Give me occasional short grammar explanations on your main mistakes. I did that when I was trying to relearn Greek a couple years ago before I went to Greece at work. Yes. And I actually ended up with an English pedagogy student in Corinth. And she just, I told her what I wanted. I tried a couple of other teachers, but they were too stuck in the academic mode. I was like, I told this girl, she's like, yeah, sure. And by the way, people who do this are cheaper. You know, find less experienced, I'm serious, find less experienced people. You know, she was like $10 an hour. I'm like, yeah, sure. You know, 2 days a week, let's go. You know, and it was great. So find a church community. This is, you know, in Kansas City, right? See if they have I know if you're committed into your church, I get it, but see if they have an evening service. The Russian had an afternoon service, they still do, right? That you can go to, start meeting some people, sit there, take notes on what you do understand, wrestle with it, watch the recording of the sermon afterwards. Language exchange websites can be helpful. I found one called mylanguageexchange.com. It's still around. For $5 you can sign up for a month and then cancel, but that's plenty of time to meet people who will say, hey, I'm a Spanish speaker wanting to learn English. Well, hey, I'm an English speaker wanting to learn Spanish. Let's meet, and we'll do half an hour in Spanish, half an hour in English. Great. You know, meet people, do that. I did a lot of that. Listen to music in the target language. Look up lyrics, analyze them. Although in some cases I was rather surprised listening to the song. But watch movies in the target language. Now, Russia has this rich culture. A lot of movies made in the Soviet era are just absolutely charming. The comedies are so funny. And what I realized was, as I was watching them, that I caught a lot of pop culture references people were saying around me. So the first time that one of my friends did something silly or made a mistake and I went, Simeon Simeonich, they looked at me and were like, yeah, there you go. Like, because Simeon Simeonich is like the naive guy in Brillante Ruka, the diamond arm, you know, this sort of comedic heist caper movie that every Russian has seen, right? By the way, here's how I would do it. Watch the movie with English subtitles. I know I sound really intense here, but okay, watch the movie with English subtitles. Watch it again with Russian subtitles. I would watch it again with Russian subtitles. And I would download the Russian subtitle SRT files. You can find them online. I would run those through. I would run those through a reading program. You can easily do this online, where you could through Google Translate. Click on words you don't know. Try to translate the meaning again. Watch it again with Russian subtitles, and watch it without, and watch it without again. I would give movies 6-7 watches. Like that's how many times I was doing this. But wow, I learned so much from doing this. I was having a great time. I was having a grand time. I love these people. I still do. I love their culture. I still do. Yes, and I know it's flawed. I realize it's flawed, but there's a lot of really beautiful things we don't talk about Russian culture. Anyway, that's a different talk. Okay. Watch movies. We're almost done here. Study grammar no more than 30% of your time at first. And get it down to 10% or less at the end, with one exception. With one exception, here it is. If you're a grammar geek. If you're a grammar geek and it intrinsically motivates you to study grammar, go for it. I was fascinated by the grammar. I studied way more than this, but I found for a lot of people, it really demotivated them to have to study the grammar. And here's the funny thing, is that when you're with a bunch of other grammar geeks in a classroom, you're having social conversations about the grammar. And what's really teaching you the English is not the grammar study as much as it is the social conversation around this really boring thing that you all love so deeply, right? So yeah, if you're a grammar geek, that's okay, but I decrease it down to 10%, decrease it to nothing by the end. You won't need it. You're going to be... and this will surprise you maybe, apps like Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, audio courses like Pimsleur, meh. Maybe, if you have time. Here's the thing that I worry about. People say, oh, do you think they're beneficial at all? The problem is that people spend what language learning time they have on this, focus on the other. Then if you have time for this, it's okay. But I don't feel like I got a lot out of this kind of... we didn't have Duolingo back then, but we had Rosetta Stone, we had Pimsleur, and I just didn't feel like I got a lot out of it compared to the authentic material that I was getting. Keep a notebook, write down all the little things you notice, questions you have, new words you want to master, and it's going to look like a big, messy stream of consciousness thing, or maybe that's just me. But because it's all just what you've been hit with as you're talking to your, tutor, or in the country if you are. keep your motivation in front of you to fight discouragement. I fought discouragement. I wasn't. There were times when I was just really discouraged. Like, how long is this going to take? I want to be there so badly right now. And you'd meet some people who would be so appreciative of the fact that you were speaking Russian. Like, we've never met an American who speaks Russian like you. And then one time I went to the pharmacy, another situation where I didn't know the right words, and the lady goes, "Come back when you learn Russian." Literally, just like that to me. And you just walk out of there going, oh. Okay, you're going to have to keep your motivation in front of you. It's got to be strong enough to sustain you through moments like that. And finally this, when I'm dragging a student to do something in English every day, I also know I have very limited time with them. In 6 months, probably they're going to be gone. If they're doing something they love in English every day, watching YouTube videos, reading blog posts, whatever it is that they're into, they're doing gaming, doing it in English, chatting. I've met people who have learned. There was a translator in Russia I encountered. Brilliant English. I'm like, how did you learn English? I'm just a gamer, man. Like, I never studied. I just started playing Counter-Strike and chatting with all my friends, and then we get together. I just started reading articles on how to play Counter-Strike better. Counter-Strike was huge in Russia at the time. And it's like, yeah, this is how I learned. There you have it. And he did that every day, and he loved and enjoyed that every day. Is it reading scripture? Then let that be. That's the only place I would advise you to go off culture, because this is universal culture for Christians in the culture who are kind of countercultural because they're in this culture. Anyway, that's it. That's my presentation. I hope this helps give you a better picture of what it means to know language and how to encourage people who are struggling to learn a language but don't quite get some of these concepts. Any questions? Ryan.
How worth it do you think it is to try to invest time into learning a language that, like, you don't plan on moving into culture or using it super regularly? Like, I have Portuguese family, and so very occasionally we get together for holidays or whatever, it would be cool to speak Portuguese. But my regular day-to-day life, I realistically would never use Portuguese. So, considering there wouldn't probably be a ton of motivation, should I even try to be motivated to do something like that?
I would honestly say in this case, no.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to tell you that, but because language is a socially developed construct and it serves a social purpose, if you're not going to be in a social group on some kind of regular basis, even conversing with somebody, a tutor once or twice a week can become a social experience, right? If you're not going to be doing that, realistically, that's not enough motivation. Your brain's doing the ROI. It's saying, yeah, you know what? Time's better spent on other things. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's nothing wrong with saying, I just don't have the motivation to do this right now. Do other things you have the motivation to do, right? Just be realistic about it. I hope that doesn't offend. Like,
No.
there's nothing it's not to suggest that you're a bad person but I just know a lot of Greek people who do the same thing. I have a cousin who says, I wish I'd learned the language better. He knows way less than me. And he goes, maybe I should, pick up some Greek. I'll take a few lessons here and there. It's like, dude, you're not around Greek people anymore. And unless you're going to make an effort to be, it's not going to happen for you. So, any other questions? Krista.
I like your plan. It's very similar to what I have done. The one question I have is that you put music as step 6, and listening. I don't know if you would agree or disagree, but listening is a receptive skill that usually comes before reading.
Yes.
So wouldn't it be better to move it higher up in the hierarchy?
So yes, let me tell you how this hierarchy works. The first thing is really the first thing. The second thing happened to be mine, but you're right, music was in there somewhere. But so this is in the order in which they should be done, or that I happen to have remembered them. So it's not a really strict order.
Well, it's just
But I agree. I really like with what you said, and I almost got into this. The whole idea of you guys here say something that's really important: receptive and productive skills. And this is actually why Krashen advocated for this silent period, because you can actually know thousands of words in a language and only be able to speak like 3,000 words, but only have command of 1,000 of actual use, and that's okay. That's very normal. You'll always have more words that you like. You'll have read a word 10, 15 for me, like 15 times, and then you just finally like, okay, I get that word, I get what it means. And then I still remember the times when I was like, okay, I'm going to try. I remember a conversation I had with our yardsman, and I was talking about a gap, and I'd never used the word promajutuk before, which means gap. And I'm like, okay, I read it in this book, I'm going to try it. Okay. And I said, in the gap between the building and the fence, there is a, and he understood me perfectly. I was just like, yes. And clink, you heard that word move from the receptive bucket to the productive bucket, and that's. But she's right, actually. Music early in the game is probably a much better idea.
Well, one reason I said it is because this from I've used all of these in my own learning experience, and I teach them when I'm teaching English as a second language. But the thing I found is the music is I always start with that one because you can listen to it without paying attention to it.
Right.
But then you learn the phonology or the sounds of the language so that when you start learning the letters, you have a sound to associate with them already.
One of the first songs I learned in Russian, this really sappy pop love ballad that was out at the time. And Russians are not afraid to be very emotional in their music. They may not look that to you when you meet them, but their music is very emotional. And it was just this big, sappy, heartbreaking love song. And it just really was catchy, and it stuck in my head. And just
country music?
What?
Country music?
No, not quite country.
Dog, truck, train.
Yeah. So good point. Any other questions, comments? Can sing a Russian song for you?
Russian national anthem.
Похож на дерево я, при потоках вод, верю я Боге, он мне силу дает. I'm like a tree
Don't go too
planted
far.
by the
YouTube
waters.
some
I
flags.
believe in God, and He gives me strength. The kids would sing that in Sunday school. It was so cute to hear them sing that. And actually, one of my great thrills. I'll close on this. And this is these are the kinds of things that can happen. Sometimes that's the other thing I noticed, and it was one of my themes in my research, that the motivations grew over time as people realized what the language is doing for them and the opportunities it was opening up. I had a friend who, at the time I was in Russia, actually kind of hit it big with a band here and was playing in stadiums as a guitarist with this band. And I remember being really happy for him. But I also remember having my moments where I was playing guitar in elementary chapel at Hingston Christian Academy with 60 kids singing songs like that. And we would do both English and we would do some Russian verses. And it was just so beautiful to hear them sing. And I was like, this is like my opus right here. This is as good as it gets for me. And the language made those kinds of things possible. So I would just encourage you, that if you have any kind of spark to learn a language, and if you have a love for a particular people group, just really chase that and merge those two things. Clear some things out of your schedule. I didn't read a lot of books in English or watch a lot of movies in English for about 7 years, because I made time to study this people I dearly loved and to study a language that would help me communicate with them and have these kinds of experiences. And it doesn't have to be there. It can be here. And I would say, too, Spanish, there's a lot less of a gap between Spanish and English than Russian and English. If you have Spanish churches in the area, and you have so much need with families that are here, that have children going to school, that need help navigating culture, the opportunity to be a light, a witness to them. We served at a Burmese church last summer, helping them, helping parents, grapple with learning some English so they can speak to their kids who are losing their English as they're going to, schools, or losing their home language as they're going to schools and only speaking English, right? So the difference, the impact you can have is just absolutely astounding if you would, if you can imagine it. If you can imagine it. Use your God-given imagination to see it. I'll close in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to love the full scope of your creation. Lord, we are saddened and disheartened by sinful man and what he has done to this world, and yet we love sinful man. And we love, Lord, we love him, her, we love these people, Lord, that we encounter because they are also made in your image, and they have deep and abiding value. We love the fact that you created us with these different cultures, and yes, Lord, maybe multiple languages wasn't part of the original plan, but they are now a rich expression of all of these different